Today we talked about these changes in surface profile, the cover stock, the continuum core, this benchmark bowling ball, and the addition of the second dimension to the line, which is a new idea in cover stock technology. This pearlized cover with the different textured mica particles, a little larger in size. So now we're going to get two test models to throw those for you. Ernest Godick, our technical director, and actually Corbett Austin, our vice president of operations. Both great bowlers in their own right. We'll get to see them throw it down the lane. So let's look at the two layouts that we're going to be using today. In Corbett's ball, Corbett's a little bit higher rev player, but he does have a little bit lower axis than a standard player. So what we see is his axis is 3.5 inches over and about 3/4 of an inch up. A 5-inch axis to pin to PAP, a 5-inch spun mass bias. We spun this on the determinator, determined the mass bias after drilling, and he has a 2.25 inch pin buffer. So a 5-inch pin from the axis, a 5-inch mass bias, and a 2.25 inch pin buffer. This is going to give us some length, a little sharper break point. The shorter buffer creates a shorter transition period, so it should give us a very strong motion. We're going to use the same layout in a second dimension with a standard box finish. Both balls have box finish, 2000 grit Abralon on a dimension, and a 1500 grit polished on the second dimension. We notice the same layouts, 5. A little bit longer on the mass bias, just a touch, 2.5 inch buffer. We still notice an almost identical layout in those bowling balls. So those we'll see in Corbett. And then in Ernest, same thing, but we're going to use a little different layout for Ernest. We're going to use a 4 5/8, a little stronger, a little higher flaring layout, 4.5 pin to the PAP. He's got about a 7 3/4 inch pin to his spun mass bias, and what this is going to do is creates a little more arc or smooth motion down the lane. 2 5/8 inch, 2.5 inch buffer, still creates a shorter transition period, but a little more control down the lane. We notice the second dimension has the exact same layout. Trying to show you two different layouts, styles of players. Corbett, high rev player. Ernest, a high rev player, a little different axis point, a little over 5 1/4 over, probably 0. So we'll look at those two in action. Okay, great example here. We see Corbett throwing that last shot, traveling down the lane. It picks up in the mids, reads up, makes a nice smooth continuous motion. And what we see is it's just a nice soft roll through the pocket. Now we're going to throw and that's an original dimension. Now we're going to throw a second dimension in relation. We should see the ball a little cleaner through the front. It's still that strong read in the mids, but we're going to see more continuation down the lane. Bingo. Okay, great example. Those last two shots are pretty close to each other in the lane, but notice that second dimension picks up in the mid lane really strong, and all of a sudden it still has a lot of motion down the lane. But notice that how it reads through the mids, doesn't over push through the mids, picks up really nice, exactly what we're looking for in comparison from an original dimension to a second dimension. Once again, we notice that ball as it picks up the mid lane. Watch that axis come up off, and it's rotating off its axis pretty quickly and making that strong motion. But notice that it's a strong, smooth, controllable, real continuous motion, which is very famous for dimension. Benchmark bowling ball, benchmark reaction. Now let's compare it to the second dimension, and notice that we're going to see a little bit more angle and motion down lane. Perfect shot there. Once again, we notice those two balls pretty close to the same line down the lane. But notice that second dimension still picks up once again in the mid. But notice how strong it is down lane, how strong it rolls through the pin deck, how it keeps the pins low, pushes them off the deck. Picture perfect. Corbett Austin should be on the PBA Tour. Okay, perfect shot there. Notice Ernest is a little different style of player. Ernest has a lot less tilt, and he has, like I said, a little higher axis point. And his axis rotation is a little bit less than Corbett's. still a higher rev flare, but what we noticed on this shot is how that ball picks up, that aggressive dimension cover picks up, so he has to kind of create a little bit more room, a little more angle, so the ball doesn't read too fast. Ball very aggressive layout. Remember, this was a 4 5/8 pin from the axis, so a little bit more flare, so this ball is very aggressive on this house pattern. Notice how much motion it creates mid to back, but notice how smooth and controllable it is off the spot. Let's look at the second dimension in comparison. Once again, great shot. Notice how that ball is more on a straight line path towards its break point. But notice that axis comes up off, it flares up pretty quick, makes a really strong motion down the lane. Even though it is an more angular motion, it is very readable. Very sharp, but readable. Once again, delaying it through the front, creating the mids and backs. We see that more entry angle. Once again, keeping the pins moving through the deck a lot faster, a lot quicker, and a lot lower. Great shot.